The laughter came first, sharp and cutting, before Eleanor Whitmore even understood what had been said about her. She stood near the edge of the ballroom, gloved hands folded in front of her pale blue gown, watching candlelight flicker across polished floors and spinning couples. Her sister Charlotte's voice carried clearly over the music, pitched just loud enough to be heard. 29 years old and still unclaimed, Charlotte said to the circle of young women around her, fanning herself with practiced boredom. Poor Eleanor. Mother says she has given up hope entirely. The young women tittered. One of them, a girl with golden curls named Sophie Bellamy, glanced toward Eleanor with something close to pity, then quickly looked away, as if unmarried status might be contagious. Eleanor kept her spine straight. She had learned, over many seasons of this exact humiliation, that the only defense was stillness. If she did not react, the sting could not be seen. She reached for a glass of lemonade from a passing footman's tray simply to give her hands something to do. She still writes those letters, you know, Charlotte continued, lowering her voice only slightly, which meant everyone within 10 feet could still hear her clearly. Whole evenings spent scratching away with a pen. What use is that to a woman with no husband and no prospects? Lord Percival Ashby, Charlotte's fiancé, strolled up beside her and slid an arm around her waist. He was a tall man, with a lazy smile and eyes that always seemed to be searching a room for someone more interesting to talk to. Perhaps she is writing love letters to herself, he said, and the group laughed harder. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the cool glass. She thought of 100 replies, each one sharper than the last, and said none of them. Their mother, Lady Margaret Whitmore, stood only a few paces away, deep in conversation with another matron, and made no move to intervene. She had not intervened in years. To Lady Margaret, Eleanor's unmarried state was not a tragedy to be defended, but an embarrassment to be managed, preferably by pretending it did not exist. Only Beatrice, the youngest of the three sisters, still just 17 and not yet fully out in society, crossed the floor toward her. Beatrice slipped her arm through Eleanor's and squeezed gently. "Do not listen to them," Beatrice whispered. "Charlotte is only cruel because she is frightened of becoming exactly like you, if her engagement to Lord Ashby should ever fail." Eleanor allowed herself the faintest smile. "That is not comforting, dearest, but I thank you for the intention." "You are the cleverest of us," Beatrice said. "Someday everyone in this room will regret their laughter." Eleanor did not believe that. She had heard such reassurances before, from Beatrice and from her old governess, Mrs. Agatha Combe, and none of them had ever come true. 9 seasons she had endured this ballroom, and a dozen others just like it, each one filled with the same whispers, the same pitying glances, the same certainty settling over the room that Eleanor Whitmore was simply meant to be alone. She thought, not for the first time that evening, of her father, gone now these 4 years, and of the quiet way their family's fortunes had shrunk since his passing. He had left behind debts no one spoke of openly, and a modest income that Lady Margaret managed with a nervous, tight-fisted precision that left little room for softness. Eleanor understood, in the practical part of her mind that never quite stopped calculating, that a good marriage for any of the Whitmore daughters was not simply a matter of pride but of survival. Charlotte's match with Lord Ashby, however unremarkable the man himself might be, had eased some of that pressure. Eleanor's own failure to secure a husband across 9 seasons had done the opposite, a fact her mother reminded her of more often than either of them found comfortable. It was not that no one had ever offered for her. There had been a widowed merchant in her 3rd season, kind enough but nearly twice her age, and a country parson in her 5th, whose conversation consisted entirely of sermons he had already given and intended to give again. She had refused them both, gently, and had spent the years since wondering whether her mother had been right to call her foolish for it. "Better a plain marriage than none at all," Lady Margaret had said more than once. Eleanor had never quite been able to agree, though she had also never found the courage to explain why, not even to herself in the quiet of her own room. She had stopped minding, mostly. Or she had told herself she had stopped minding, which was not quite the same thing, but close enough to survive on. Across the room, Colonel Edmund Hale watched the entire exchange with his jaw tight. He was a solid, quiet man of 35, a family friend since childhood, and he had loved Eleanor for longer than he cared to admit even to himself. He took a step toward her, meaning to offer his arm for the next dance, if only to spare her from standing alone through another set. But before he could cross the floor, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the entire room seemed to draw one collective breath. The music did not stop, but many of the dancers faltered in their steps, glancing toward the entrance. Conversations dimmed to whispers. Even Charlotte's circle turned, mid-laugh, to see what had caused the sudden hush. A man stood in the doorway, tall and dark-coated, his expression unreadable. Eleanor recognized him instantly, as did everyone else in the room, because there was only one man in London who could silence an entire ballroom simply by entering it. Duke Alistair Sinclair. He was known by many names in society, most of them whispered rather than spoken aloud. The Cold Duke, the Duke who never smiles. Some called him worse, in darker corners of drawing rooms, though none of them knew the true reason behind his reputation, only that he attended perhaps 2 events each season, spoke to almost no one, and left before midnight without exception. He was, by every measure that mattered to the mothers of London, the most eligible unmarried man in England, and also the most unreachable. Dukes did not come more untouchable than Alistair Sinclair, and every young woman in that ballroom, including Charlotte and her circle, straightened at once, smoothing their skirts, arranging their expressions into practiced pleasantness, hoping against hope that tonight might be the night his cold gaze finally landed on one of them. Eleanor felt none of that hope. She had long since stopped imagining herself the object of any man's attention, let alone a duke's. She simply watched, as curious as anyone else, wondering what could have possibly drawn him out on a night such as this. Lady Margaret appeared at Charlotte's elbow within seconds, her eyes bright with sudden calculation. "Stand up straighter, Charlotte," she murmured, "and smile, not too widely. He does not care for eagerness." Charlotte obeyed instantly, tilting her chin at what she clearly believed was a flattering angle. Beside her, Sophie Bellamy and the other young women arranged themselves with equal precision, a small army preparing for a battle none of them could have named. Eleanor took a step backward instead, closer to the wall, closer to the shadows near the refreshment table where she felt she belonged. She had no interest in competing for a man's attention, least of all a man so famous for offering none. She lifted her lemonade to her lips and told herself she would finish her drink, endure another hour of the evening, and then quietly ask the driver to bring the carriage round. The Duke moved through the room slowly, his pace unhurried despite the way every eye followed him. He greeted no one, though several gentlemen nodded toward him and received only the barest inclination of his head in return. He passed close to a cluster of eligible young ladies who had positioned themselves directly in his path, and he walked past them entirely, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, as though searching for something he had not yet found. Charlotte's smile faltered slightly as he passed her without so much as a glance. Lady Margaret's mouth pressed into a thin line of disappointment. Eleanor watched all this with mild curiosity, more interested in the drama unfolding among her family than in the Duke himself. She had turned partly away, intending to slip toward the terrace doors for a moment of quiet air, when she felt it, a shift in the room. A stillness that was different from the stillness before. She turned back. Duke Alistair Sinclair had stopped walking. He stood perhaps 20 feet from her, near the edge of the dance floor, and his dark eyes were fixed directly on her, with an intensity that made her breath catch somewhere in her chest. For a moment, Eleanor thought she must be mistaken. Surely he was looking past her, at someone else, at Charlotte perhaps, or at one of the many prettier, younger, more eligible women scattered throughout the room. She glanced quickly over her shoulder to see who stood behind her. There was no one, only the wall and a potted fern and a footman clearing an empty tray. When she turned back, the Duke had not moved his gaze at all. If anything, his expression had sharpened, as though he too could not quite believe what he was seeing. The music continued. The dancers continued their steps, but for Eleanor, the entire ballroom seemed to fall away, leaving only the strange, impossible fact of a Duke looking at her, the overlooked elder sister, as if she were the only person in the room worth seeing at all. Charlotte noticed. Lady Margaret noticed. Colonel Hale, still halfway across the floor with his intended words of comfort forgotten on his tongue, noticed most of all, and something in his chest went cold and tight. Duke Sinclair began walking again. Not toward Charlotte, not toward Sophie Bellamy or any of the young women arranged so carefully in his path. He walked directly toward Eleanor. The whispers that followed him were no longer quiet at all. Eleanor set down her lemonade with hands that were not quite steady, and for the first time in 9 long seasons, she found she did not know what to do with her own stillness. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had imagined from across the room, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if it were not carved so permanently into hard, unreadable lines. His eyes, though, were not cold at all. They were simply guarded, like a door someone had shut and locked long ago and forgotten how to open. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low, quiet, meant only for her. "I do not believe we have been introduced." Around them, the ballroom had gone very still. Even the musicians seemed to be playing more softly, as though the entire orchestra had leaned in to listen. "We have not, Your Grace," Eleanor managed, proud that her voice did not shake. "Though I confess I am surprised you know my name at all. I asked a footman," he said simply, without embarrassment. "I wished to know before I made a fool of myself in front of the whole of London." A ripple of surprised laughter rose from somewhere behind him, quickly stifled. Eleanor blinked. She had expected many things from this strange encounter, but not honesty, and certainly not the faint, dry humor beneath his words. "And why," she asked carefully, "would you make a fool of yourself over me, Your Grace?" "Because I intend to ask you to dance," he said, "and I have been told that I dance rather badly, and that everyone will watch, and that you will likely regret accepting." Eleanor felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, something she had not felt in this ballroom in a very long time. It took her a moment to recognize it as amusement. "That is a very poor case you are making for yourself, Your Grace." "I have never been good at making cases for myself," he admitted. "I find it easier to simply ask the question directly. Will you dance with me, Miss Whitmore?" Every eye in the ballroom was upon them now, openly, without pretense. Charlotte stood frozen mid-conversation, her fan hanging forgotten at her side. Lady Margaret's mouth had fallen slightly open. Sophie Bellamy and the other young women exchanged glances of pure disbelief. Colonel Hale, still standing where he had stopped, watched with an expression he was careful to keep from his face, though his hands had curled into fists at his sides. Eleanor looked at the Duke's outstretched hand, gloved in dark leather, steady and waiting. 9 years of whispers rose in her mind. 9 years of being the woman no one chose, the sister mentioned only in comparison, the daughter her own mother had quietly given up on. She thought of walking away, of protecting herself from whatever cruel joke this might turn out to be. Because surely a man like this did not simply choose a woman like her without some reason she could not yet see. But his eyes did not waver. There was no mockery in them, no performance for the watching crowd, only a strange, quiet earnestness that made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. She placed her hand in his. "I will dance with you, Your Grace," she said, "though I make no promises about not regretting it myself." Something shifted in his expression then, the faintest suggestion of a smile, gone almost before it appeared. But Eleanor had seen it, and something in her wondered if very many people ever had. He led her onto the floor as the current dance ended and a new one began, a slow waltz that gave them space to speak as they moved. His hand rested at her waist with careful precision, neither too close nor too distant, and his steps, contrary to his warning, were perfectly measured. "You lied to me," Eleanor said as they turned. "You dance beautifully." "I lied about very little," he said. "I only exaggerated the danger of the outcome. I still expected you to regret it." "I have not decided yet," she said, and this time she allowed herself a small smile of her own. They danced in silence for a moment, the eyes of the entire room still fixed upon them, though Eleanor found, to her own surprise, that she cared less than she would have thought. There was something steadying about the Duke's presence, something that made the whispers around them feel distant, unimportant. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said finally. "You may ask. I cannot promise I will answer well." "Why me?" "There are a dozen younger, prettier, more eligible women in this room, all of them arranged very carefully in your path tonight. I am neither young nor eligible by London standards. Why did you cross the entire ballroom for me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly, as though considering how much truth he wished to give her. "Because every woman in this room tonight has spent the last hour performing for me," he said at last. "Arranging herself just so, laughing at things that are not amusing, agreeing with opinions she does not hold, all in the hope of becoming a duchess. I have watched it happen at every ball I have attended for the last 6 years, and I confess I have grown very tired of it." "And I was not performing," Eleanor said slowly, understanding. "You were standing quite alone, near the wall, clearly wishing to be elsewhere," he said. "And when I looked at you, you did not smile at me the way the others smiled. You looked faintly annoyed that I had noticed you at all." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I apologize if my expression was rude, Your Grace." "Do not apologize," he said, and for the first time, real warmth entered his voice. It was the first honest expression I have seen directed at me in longer than I care to admit. The dance ended far too soon. As the music faded and the Duke stepped back to bow, Eleanor became aware once more of the room around them, of the whispers already beginning to swell, of Charlotte's furious expression and Lady Margaret's calculating eyes, and Colonel Hale's carefully blank face. Thank you for the dance, Miss Whitmore, the Duke said, straightening from his bow. I hope I have not caused you too much trouble. I suspect you have caused me a great deal of trouble, Your Grace, Eleanor said honestly, but I find, strangely, that I do not mind it. He studied her for a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes. Then he bowed once more, and turned, and walked from the ballroom the same way he had entered it, without another word to anyone else in the room, leaving behind him a silence far louder than any conversation could have been. The moment the doors closed behind him, the ballroom erupted into whispers. Charlotte crossed the floor to Eleanor, in 3 sharp strides, her face flushed with an anger she was struggling to hide beneath a brittle smile, for the benefit of the watching crowd. What did you say to him? She hissed under her breath. What trick did you use? I used no trick, Charlotte, Eleanor said quietly. He simply asked me to dance. He does not simply ask anyone to dance, Charlotte snapped. He has refused every woman in London for 6 years. Every mother in this room has tried to place her daughter in his path, and he has ignored every single one of them. And he walks straight to you? Perhaps, Eleanor said, feeling something new and unfamiliar steady itself in her chest. Something that felt almost like pride. He simply saw something in me that no one else in this room has bothered to look for. Lady Margaret arrived a moment later, her expression already transforming from shock into something far more calculating. Eleanor, she said, taking her daughter's arm with sudden, unaccustomed warmth. My dear girl, we must speak about your gown for the Ashworth ball next week. Something new, I think. Something that draws the eye properly. Eleanor stared at her mother, marveling at how quickly 9 years of near invisibility could be erased by a single dance with the right man. Across the room, Colonel Hale watched the entire scene unfold with a heaviness settling deep in his chest. He had known Eleanor Whitmore since she was a girl of 12, climbing trees at her father's estate while her sisters played with dolls indoors. He had loved her, quietly, faithfully, for the better part of a decade, always certain there would be time enough to speak, always telling himself that next season, next ball, next quiet moment together, he would finally find the courage. He had waited too long. He understood that now, watching Eleanor's face as she spoke with her mother, a face more animated than he had seen it in years, lit from within by something he had never managed to give her himself. He turned away before anyone could see his expression, and made his way quietly toward the door, leaving the ballroom and its whispers behind him, carrying with him a grief he had no right to feel, for a woman who had never truly been his to lose. Eleanor herself remained in the ballroom for the rest of the evening, though she moved through it now with a strange, unfamiliar lightness, as though a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there had suddenly, briefly, been lifted from her shoulders. Sophie Bellamy approached her during the next set, her earlier pity replaced by open curiosity. I did not know you were acquainted with the Duke, Sophie said, not unkindly, simply astonished. Neither did I, until tonight, Eleanor admitted, and found that she could laugh a little at the absurdity of it, a laugh Sophie joined after a moment's surprise. He has refused to dance with anyone for 3 seasons running, Sophie said. My own mother despaired of ever seeing him partnered with anybody at all. Whatever you said to him, Miss Whitmore, I confess I am rather impressed. I said very little, Eleanor said honestly. I think perhaps that was the whole of it. She danced twice more that evening, with gentlemen who had scarcely looked her way in previous seasons but who now seemed newly curious about the woman a duke had chosen to notice. Eleanor accepted their attention with polite reserve, aware that most of it had little to do with any genuine interest in her, and everything to do with the sudden, borrowed glamour of the Duke's regard. It was a strange sensation, being seen at last, yet knowing the seeing was not truly for her own sake. On the carriage ride home, Charlotte sat in stony silence beside their mother, while Beatrice chattered excitedly about the evening, replaying every detail of the Duke's approach with evident delight. Lady Margaret said little, though Eleanor caught her studying her eldest daughter's face in the dim lantern light with an expression she could not quite place, somewhere between calculation and, for the briefest moment, something that might almost have been regret. You danced very well tonight, Eleanor, Lady Margaret said finally, as the carriage rattled over the cobblestones toward home. Thank you, Mother, Eleanor said, surprised by the simple compliment, unaccustomed to receiving one so freely. I only wonder, Lady Margaret added, unable to help herself, what on earth you said to capture his attention so completely, when 9 seasons of far more determined effort from other young ladies have failed entirely. Eleanor looked out the carriage window at the passing streets, lit by scattered lamplight, and considered the question seriously before answering. I think, Mother, that I said nothing at all. I think, for the first time in 9 years, someone simply looked past what I was saying and saw who I actually was. Lady Margaret did not respond to that, though she was quiet for the remainder of the ride home, and Eleanor wondered, not for the first time that night, whether some small part of her mother understood exactly what she meant, and regretted, if only briefly, the years spent looking past her eldest daughter entirely. By morning, the story had already traveled the length of London. Eleanor knew this the moment she came down to breakfast and found her mother already seated, a stack of calling cards arranged neatly beside her teacup, more visitors announced in a single morning than the Whitmore household had received in the past 3 months combined. Lady Fenwick called at 9, Lady Margaret said without looking up, sorting through the cards with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign. The Countess of Marlowe at 9:30. Even Mrs. Palmer Gray, who has not spoken 2 words to this family since your father's unfortunate business investment 5 years ago, saw fit to leave her card this morning. How curious, Eleanor said, taking her seat at the table and reaching for the teapot. It is not curious at all, Lady Margaret said. It is exactly what happens when a duke dances with a woman in front of the entire season's finest families. Everyone wishes to know you now, Eleanor. Everyone wishes to understand what secret you have been hiding all these years. I have no secret, Eleanor said. I danced with a man who asked me kindly, and who seemed, for reasons I do not fully understand, to prefer honesty to flattery. It does not matter what actually happened, Lady Margaret said, waving a hand as though brushing away an inconvenient fact. What matters is what people believe happened, and what people now believe is that the Duke of Ravenswood finds you fascinating. We must use this, Eleanor. This may be the only opportunity of its kind you will ever receive. Eleanor set down her teacup with more force than she intended. I am not a horse to be paraded at market, Mother. Do not be dramatic, Lady Margaret said, though her eyes had narrowed slightly at Eleanor's tone, a tone she was not accustomed to hearing from her eldest, most obedient daughter. I am only saying that we should be sensible about your appearance at the Ashworth ball, and perhaps consider a new gown, and perhaps ensure you are seated somewhere the Duke might see you again, should he attend. Charlotte entered the breakfast room at that moment, still in her dressing gown, her expression carrying none of the warmth she had shown at supper the previous evening. She had clearly not slept well. Good morning, Eleanor, she said, her voice tight and overly bright. I hear half of London called on you this morning. How exciting for you, after so many quiet years. Charlotte, Beatrice said warningly from her own seat by the window, where she had been reading and largely ignoring the conversation until now. I only meant to congratulate her, Charlotte said, though her smile did not reach her eyes. It must be quite a change being noticed at last. Eleanor met her sister's gaze steadily. She had endured Charlotte's cruelty for so many years that she had grown almost fluent in its many disguises, and she recognized this one immediately: jealousy, dressed carefully in the costume of concern. It is a change, Eleanor agreed simply, refusing to give Charlotte the reaction she was clearly hoping for, though I confess, I do not yet know what to make of it. The days that followed brought more of the same. Wherever Eleanor went, whispers followed, though their tone had shifted entirely from the pitying murmurs of the past 9 seasons to something closer to fascinated speculation. At the milliner's shop, 2 women she did not recognize stopped their conversation entirely when she entered, watching her with open curiosity as she selected ribbon for a bonnet. At church on Sunday, the vicar's wife, who had never once spoken to Eleanor beyond a polite greeting, invited her to tea with unusual enthusiasm. Through it all, Eleanor found herself unable to fully enjoy the sudden attention, because beneath the curiosity, an uglier current had begun to flow as well. She heard it first from Beatrice, who came to her room one evening looking troubled, her book forgotten in her lap. There is talk, Beatrice said carefully, that you must have done something improper to catch the Duke's attention so suddenly. Some say you arranged the meeting beforehand. Others say worse things, that you offered him something no respectable woman would offer, in exchange for his notice. Eleanor felt the words land like a blow, though she had suspected something of the sort was circulating. And where does this talk come from, do you think? Beatrice hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door, as though checking that no one else could hear. I do not know for certain, but I have heard Charlotte speaking with Lord Ashby in the garden, more than once this week, in voices too low for me to make out clearly. I do not like to accuse her without proof, Eleanor, but I thought you should know. Eleanor sat very still, absorbing this. It should not have surprised her, and yet it did. A small, sharp ache beneath her ribs at the thought that her own sister might be the source of such cruelty. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. I will be careful. Eleanor sought refuge, as she often did in difficult weeks, in the small writing desk tucked into the corner of her bedroom, where she kept a locked drawer containing years of correspondence with a literary journal in the north of England. She had begun writing under the name E.W. Hartley some 6 years earlier, after Mrs. Combe had first encouraged her to send along a short story she had scribbled almost by accident one rainy afternoon. The editor, a Mr. Grant, had accepted it without hesitation, and had continued publishing her work ever since, never once suspecting that the sharp, adventurous heroines in her stories were penned by a woman society considered too plain and too old to matter. She took up her pen that evening and began a new tale, one about a young woman mistaken for a servant at a grand estate, who used the invisibility of her disguise to outwit a scheming steward and save the household from ruin. It was, she realized only after several pages, not entirely unlike her own situation, a woman overlooked precisely because no one thought to look closely enough to see what she was truly capable of. Writing had always steadied her in this way, giving shape and purpose to feelings she could not otherwise express, and by the time she set down her pen well past midnight, the sting of Charlotte's whispered rumors had softened into something she could carry more easily. That same week, a letter arrived for her, delivered not by the usual post but by a liveried servant who requested to place it directly into her hands. The paper was heavy and fine, sealed with dark wax pressed with an unfamiliar crest. Eleanor waited until she was alone in her room before breaking the seal. The handwriting was firm, slightly slanted, unmistakably a man's hand, careful and controlled. Miss Whitmore, I find that our conversation at the Ashworth ball, brief as it was, has occupied my thoughts more than I anticipated. I do not offer such correspondence lightly, and I understand you may have heard talk regarding our dance that concerns you. I wish to write plainly, as I find I prefer plainness to games. I would like to call upon you, if you are willing to receive me. I make no promises of what such a visit might lead to, only that I intend it honestly, and that I have no interest in causing you further difficulty with your family or your standing. If you would rather I did not call, you need only send no reply, and I will trouble you no further. Yours, Alistair Sinclair. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and pressing it against her chest, as though she could hold its words closer by doing so. It was not a romantic letter, not by the standards of the novels she sometimes read late at night by candlelight. It offered no declarations, no poetry, no promises of devotion, and yet its honesty struck her more deeply than any romantic phrase could have, because in 9 years of being overlooked, she had grown fluent in recognizing performance, and this letter contained none of it. She thought of her old governess, Mrs. Agatha Combe, who had left the Whitmore household some years ago to keep a small cottage on the edge of the estate, but who still called on Eleanor regularly, and whose counsel Eleanor had come to trust more than her own mother's. The following afternoon, Eleanor walked the familiar path to the cottage, the Duke's letter tucked carefully into her reticule. Mrs. Combe listened to the entire account without interruption, her sharp eyes studying Eleanor's face as she spoke, missing nothing. "And what do you feel when you think of him?" Mrs. Combe asked finally, pouring tea with steady hands despite her advancing years. "I do not know," Eleanor admitted, confused, mostly, suspicious, if I am honest. "It seems impossible that a man such as he would choose a woman such as I, without some reason I have not yet discovered." "And why should it be impossible?" Mrs. Combe asked, her tone sharpening slightly. "You have spent so many years being told you are unremarkable, Eleanor, that you have come to believe it yourself, despite all evidence to the contrary. You are clever. You are kind, though you hide it well beneath practical good sense. You notice things other people miss, and you have never once, in all the years I have known you, been cruel to another soul, even when cruelty was shown to you first." Eleanor felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. "You make me sound like a heroine from one of my own letters. Perhaps you are one," Mrs. Combe said. "You have simply never allowed yourself to believe it. Your family has told you a story about yourself for 9 years, that you are the sister who was left behind, the daughter no one wanted. But that story was never true, Eleanor. It was only convenient, for a family more concerned with appearances than with truth. What should I do about the letter, then?" "That," Mrs. Combe said, "is not a question I can answer for you, but I will say this. A man who writes so plainly, who offers no false promises and asks only whether you are willing to be known, is either a very rare kind of honest man, or a very skilled kind of liar. You will not learn which by refusing to see him again. You will only learn by watching carefully, and trusting your own judgment above your mother's ambitions or your sister's jealousy." That evening, Eleanor sat at her writing desk long after the rest of the household had retired, a single candle burning low, a fresh sheet of paper before her. She thought of the whispers already circulating through London, of Charlotte's tight, jealous smiles, of her mother's sudden, calculating warmth. She thought of 9 years of ballrooms where she had stood unseen, and of one strange, honest man who had crossed an entire crowded room simply because she had not smiled the way everyone else did. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write. Your Grace, you may call upon me on Thursday afternoon if that suits your schedule. I make no promises either, only that I too prefer plainness to games, and that I am curious to know more of a man who dances so carefully and speaks so honestly to a woman most of London has spent 9 years failing to notice at all. Yours, Eleanor Whitmore. She sealed the letter before she could change her mind, and sent it with the morning post, her heart beating with a strange, unfamiliar mixture of fear and hope that she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. Thursday arrived gray and cool, with a thin mist clinging to the gardens of the Whitmore estate, and Eleanor found herself checking her reflection 3 times before noon, an exercise she had not bothered with in years. Lady Margaret had insisted on preparing the good parlor for the visit, ordering fresh flowers arranged in the finest vases the household possessed, and instructing the staff to serve the good china rather than the everyday set. Charlotte had made herself scarce that morning, claiming a headache, though Eleanor suspected the true cause had less to do with her health and more to do with her inability to watch the Duke arrive for her sister rather than herself. Duke Sinclair arrived precisely at the appointed hour, dressed simply for a morning call, without the formal severity of his ballroom attire. He greeted Lady Margaret with polite correctness, bowed to Beatrice, who watched him with open curiosity, and then turned to Eleanor with an expression that softened almost imperceptibly. Miss Whitmore, he said, thank you for allowing my visit. Your Grace, Eleanor replied, offering a small curtsy. I confess I am still uncertain what to make of it, but I am glad you came. Lady Margaret, hovering nearby with obvious intent to remain for the entire visit, was gently but firmly redirected by the Duke's simple request that he and Eleanor be permitted to walk the gardens, within sight of the house but out of easy earshot. Lady Margaret's disappointment was evident, but propriety demanded she agree, and so Eleanor found herself walking beside the Duke along the gravel paths of her family's modest gardens, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet, a chaperone trailing at a discreet distance behind them. You seem surprised that I came, the Duke said, after they had walked in silence for a few moments. I am surprised by a great many things regarding you, Your Grace, Eleanor admitted, not least that a man with your reputation would trouble himself with garden walks and morning calls at all. My reputation, he repeated, a faint, humorless edge entering his voice. You have heard the stories then, the cold Duke, the Duke who never smiles. I have heard those, yes, and worse, on occasion. They are not entirely wrong, he said, surprising her with his candor. I have earned a great deal of that reputation honestly, through years of avoiding society whenever possible, and treating those I could not avoid with less patience than they deserved. May I ask why? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the path ahead of them, his jaw tight in a way that told Eleanor she had touched something he did not often discuss. 6 years ago, he said finally, I was engaged to be married. Her name was Margaret Ellison, the daughter of an earl, considered a great beauty, much admired throughout London. I believed, foolishly, that our engagement was built on genuine affection. What happened? I discovered, 3 weeks before our wedding, that she had accepted my proposal only after her family calculated that no better offer would arrive, and that she had, in fact, been carrying on a private understanding with another man of lesser fortune the entire time, a man she genuinely loved but could not afford to marry. When I confronted her, she did not even trouble herself to deny it. She simply asked whether I intended to still go through with the marriage regardless, since the title and fortune would remain hers either way. Eleanor felt a wave of sympathy she had not expected to feel for a man so seemingly untouchable. What did you do? I ended the engagement, of course. Publicly, and without much grace, I admit. It caused a great scandal at the time, though the scandal fell far more heavily upon me than upon her, since society could more easily believe that a cold, difficult man had frightened away a sweet, beautiful woman, than that the sweet, beautiful woman had been dishonest from the beginning. He paused. After that, I found it easier to simply stop trying. I attended fewer events, I spoke to fewer people. I let the reputation grow, because a reputation for coldness, I discovered, is a very effective shield against being hurt again. Eleanor absorbed this in silence for a moment, understanding now the guarded quality she had noticed in his eyes from their very first meeting. That explains a great deal, Your Grace, though I confess I still do not fully understand why you crossed the ballroom for me, of all the women in that room. Because you were not performing. he said again, echoing what he had told her at the ball. And because, when I asked around about you before approaching, I learned something rather remarkable. Oh, and what was that? I learned that Eleanor Whitmore has spent 9 seasons being overlooked by every eligible man in London, not because there is anything lacking in her, but because London values only what glitters loudly, and pays no attention to what runs deep and quiet. He glanced at her, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. I have had quite enough of what glitters loudly, Miss Whitmore. I find I am rather more interested in what runs deep and quiet. Eleanor's chest tightened with an emotion she could not immediately name. Somewhere between disbelief and a fragile, tentative hope she was almost afraid to acknowledge. You hardly know me well enough to say such things, Your Grace. That is precisely why I asked to call on you, he said. I should like the chance to know you properly, if you are willing to grant it. Before Eleanor could answer, she shared, in turn, fragments of her own story. The years of being compared unfavorably to Charlotte's beauty and charm. The quiet cruelty of ballrooms that had taught her to make herself small and unremarkable, simply to avoid further disappointment. The private letters she wrote late at night under a pen name to a small literary journal, stories of adventure and courage that she never dared sign with her own name, for fear of being mocked for wanting more than what society had already decided she deserved. The Duke listened with a focus she had rarely experienced from anyone, asking careful questions, showing genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, and by the time they returned to the house, something had shifted between them, quiet and fragile but undeniably real. That evening, the family gathered for supper, an occasion made considerably more tense by Charlotte's continued sour mood and Lord Ashby's presence as a dinner guest, invited weeks earlier before anyone could have anticipated the Duke's sudden interest in Eleanor. I hear you had quite the visitor today, Lord Ashby said to Eleanor over the soup course, his tone carrying a familiar edge of mockery he had never bothered to hide in her presence before. The cold Duke himself, walking your garden paths. How romantic. It was a pleasant visit, Eleanor said evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. I do wonder what you two found to discuss for so long, Lord Ashby continued, glancing sideways at Charlotte with a small, conspiratorial smile. Surely not literature or philosophy. Perhaps he simply enjoys novelty, and a spinster sister makes for quite the novelty this season. The table went quiet. Beatrice's fork clattered against her plate. Lady Margaret opened her mouth, though whether to defend Eleanor or simply to smooth over the awkwardness of the moment, no one would ever know, because before she could speak, a new voice cut across the table, cold and precise. I was not aware the Duke of Ravenswood had returned for supper, came a voice from the doorway. Every head turned. Duke Sinclair stood there, having arrived, it seemed, on an invitation extended earlier that day by Lady Margaret in her enthusiasm, an invitation Eleanor had not been informed of. You must have heard Lord Ashby's comment as he entered, because his expression had gone hard and flat, the same cold, unreadable mask Eleanor had seen described in whispers throughout London. Your Grace, Lady Margaret stammered, rising quickly. We did not expect you until later. Clearly, the Duke said, his eyes fixed on Lord Ashby with an intensity that made the younger man's confident smile falter. I find I have arrived just in time to hear a guest at this table refer to Miss Whitmore as a novelty. I wonder, Lord Ashby, whether you would care to explain that remark more fully, or whether you would prefer to apologize and consider the matter closed. Lord Ashby's face reddened. I meant no offense, Your Grace, merely a jest between old family friends. I did not find it particularly amusing, the Duke said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. And I suspect Miss Whitmore did not find it amusing either, though she is, I have noticed, remarkably skilled at concealing her feelings when cruelty is directed at her. A skill she should not have needed to develop in the first place, in a household meant to protect her. The silence that followed was absolute. Charlotte stared at her plate. Lady Margaret's face had gone pale. Lord Ashby mumbled something that might have been an apology, though it lacked any real sincerity. Duke Sinclair took the empty seat beside Eleanor without waiting for further invitation, his hand briefly finding hers beneath the table, a small, steadying gesture that no one else at the table could see. Miss Whitmore, he said quietly, for her ears alone, I apologize for the interruption. But I find I have very little patience left for watching you endure what you have clearly endured for far too long. Eleanor looked at him, something warm and fierce blooming in her chest, a feeling she had not allowed herself in 9 long years. Thank you, Your Grace, she said softly. No one has ever spoken up for me at this table before. Then it is well past time someone did, he said, and for the first time since she had met him, Eleanor saw him smile fully, a real smile, unguarded and warm, meant only for her. After supper, while the rest of the family retired to the drawing room for cards, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone with him near the tall windows overlooking the darkened garden. "You did not need to defend me so publicly," she said softly. "I have grown accustomed to Lord Ashby's manner of jesting. It costs me little now to simply endure it." "That is precisely the trouble," the Duke said, his voice low and serious. "You should never have needed to grow accustomed to it in the first place. Endurance is not the same as peace, Miss Whitmore, whatever your family may have taught you to believe over the years." Eleanor considered this, turning the words over slowly. "You speak as though you understand endurance rather well yourself, Your Grace." "I have had 6 years of practice," he admitted, a faint, wry note entering his voice. "Though my endurance took the shape of avoiding people entirely rather than standing quietly among them while they wounded me. I am not certain which approach required more courage, in the end." "Perhaps neither," Eleanor said. "Perhaps courage is choosing, finally, not to endure at all, but to expect better." He studied her for a long moment in the low candlelight, something warm and unguarded passing openly across his features. "I find myself expecting a great deal better lately," he said quietly, "since a certain evening at the Ashworth ball." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, and for once did not try to hide it. "As do I, Your Grace," she admitted, "though I confess it still frightens me a little, expecting anything at all, after so many years of learning not to." "Then we shall be frightened together," he said, "and perhaps that will make it more bearable than facing it alone." Later that evening, after the Duke had taken his leave, and the house had settled into quiet, Eleanor found her mother waiting outside her bedroom door, an expression on her face that Eleanor did not immediately recognize. "I owe you an apology, I think," Lady Margaret said, twisting her hands together in a manner quite unlike her usual composure. "For many things, but tonight in particular, for sitting silent while Lord Ashby spoke to you so unkindly at my own table." "You have sat silent through worse than that, Mother, over many years," Eleanor said, not unkindly, simply honestly. Lady Margaret flinched, but did not deny it. "I know. I have told myself it was practicality, preparing you for a world that would not always be gentle. But I wonder now whether it was simply easier for me to look away than to fight your battles alongside you, when Charlotte's battles always seemed so much easier to win." Eleanor studied her mother's face, searching for the calculation she had grown so used to finding there, and found instead something that looked, for once, like genuine remorse. "I do not know what to do with this apology, Mother," she said honestly. "It comes rather late." "I know that too," Lady Margaret said. "I do not ask you to forgive 9 years in a single evening. I only wished you to know that I see it now, clearly, and I am sorry." It was not everything Eleanor might have wished to hear, and it did not undo the years of quiet neglect that had shaped her so deeply. But it was, she thought as she finally closed her bedroom door that night, a beginning, however small, and after 9 years of very little changing at all, even a small beginning felt like something worth holding on to. Charlotte did not sleep that night. She lay awake long after the household had gone quiet, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, replaying the humiliation of supper again and again in her mind. Lord Ashby scolded before the whole family by a duke who had once been considered unreachable by every woman in London, and Eleanor, plain, overlooked Eleanor, seated beside him with his hand hidden beneath the table, glowing with a happiness Charlotte had never once seen on her sister's face in 20 years of living beside her. It was unbearable. It was, Charlotte thought, deeply unfair. She had been the pretty one, the charming one, the daughter their mother had invested every hope in since childhood. She had been engaged to a viscount's son by the age of 20, had enjoyed 3 full seasons of admiration and attention, had never once known what it felt like to stand unnoticed at the edge of a ballroom. And now, in a matter of weeks, her plain elder sister had somehow captured the attention of the single most eligible man in England, while Charlotte's own engagement to Lord Ashby, once the envy of half of London, suddenly felt small and unremarkable by comparison. The following morning, she found Lord Ashby waiting for her in the garden, exactly as she had requested in a note sent before dawn. "You wish to speak with me," he said, his expression still faintly sullen from the previous evening's humiliation. "I wish to discuss Eleanor," Charlotte said without preamble. "This cannot continue, Percival. If she marries a duke, and I remain merely the wife of a viscount's second son, I will spend the rest of my life being introduced as the sister of the Duchess of Ravenswood. Do you understand what that would mean for us, for our standing?" "What would you have me do about it?" Lord Ashby asked, though something calculating had already entered his eyes. "I do not know yet," Charlotte admitted. "But there must be some way to make the Duke doubt her. He values honesty so highly, does he not? Perhaps he would value it rather less if he believed Eleanor had not been entirely honest with him. Over the following days, a plan began to take shape between them, ugly and small, born of jealousy and desperation. Lord Ashby had a cousin, a man named Frederick Vane, who resembled, from a distance and in poor light, a gentleman of Eleanor's approximate age and station. It would require little more than a whisper in the right ears, a carefully staged sighting near the edge of a public garden at dusk, and the natural appetite of London society for scandal would do the rest. The rumor began quietly, as such rumors always did. A comment dropped at a card party, a knowing glance exchanged at church, a whispered observation that Miss Whitmore had been seen walking in Green Park with an unknown gentleman, deep in private conversation, on more than one occasion that week. By the time it reached Eleanor's ears, the story had grown considerably, as rumors always did in the telling and retelling, until it suggested not merely an innocent walk but something far more improper, a secret arrangement, a betrayal of the Duke's trust conducted right beneath his nose. Eleanor first heard the whispers at a small gathering hosted by Mrs. Palmer Gray, the same woman who had so recently sought to re-establish acquaintance with the Whitmore family. She noticed the sudden hush when she entered a drawing room, the sideways glances, the way conversations dropped to murmurs the moment she passed. "What is happening?" she asked Beatrice quietly, who had accompanied her that afternoon. Beatrice's face was pale. "There is talk, Eleanor. Talk that you have been meeting secretly with another man in Green Park. I do not believe it, of course, not for a moment, but the story is spreading quickly, and I fear it may reach the Duke before you have any chance to explain." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, the fragile happiness of the past weeks suddenly threatened by something she did not fully understand. "I have done no such thing," she said. "I have not walked in Green Park in over a month." "I know," Beatrice said, "but knowing the truth and stopping a rumor are two very different things, as you well know from years of watching Charlotte spread whatever story suited her purposes." The rumor reached Duke Sinclair 2 days later, delivered not directly but through the careful, poisonous efficiency of London gossip, passed from an acquaintance at his club to another gentleman who mentioned it in passing during a business meeting, until it finally arrived, distorted and damning, at the Duke's own townhouse in the form of an anonymous note left with his butler, describing in vague but suggestive terms Miss Whitmore's supposed secret meetings. He arrived at the Whitmore estate that evening, unannounced, his expression as hard and guarded as it had been the night Eleanor first met him. All the warmth of recent weeks vanished entirely from his eyes. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, rising quickly from her seat in the parlor when he was shown in, alarmed by the coldness of his expression. "I did not expect you this evening." "I have heard a story, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice flat and controlled in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. "A story concerning secret meetings in Green Park, with a gentleman whose identity no one seems entirely certain of. I had hoped you might tell me it was entirely false." "It is entirely false," Eleanor said immediately, her heart pounding. "I have not been to Green Park in over a month, Your Grace. I do not know who has started such a rumor, but I promise you it has no truth to it whatsoever." "You understand," he said, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze, "that I have particular reasons for finding such stories difficult to simply dismiss. I have been deceived before, by a woman I trusted completely, and the deception was every bit as convincing at first as your denial sounds to me now." The comparison stung more deeply than Eleanor had expected. "I am not her, Your Grace. I am not the woman who deceived you 6 years ago. I have given you no reason to doubt my honesty in all the weeks you have known me. And yet the rumor exists," he said, "and I find myself, despite everything, uncertain what to believe." Eleanor felt something harden in her chest, a fierce, wounded pride rising up beneath the hurt. "Then perhaps, Your Grace, you should consider more carefully whether you trust me at all. Before this goes any further, I understand your past has left you cautious, and I have tried to be patient with that caution, but I will not spend the rest of my life proving my honesty to a man who chooses gossip over the evidence of his own eyes and the weeks we have spent together. If that is truly who you are, then perhaps we were mistaken about each other from the very beginning." She turned and left the room before he could respond, her hands trembling, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall in front of him. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom and closed the door quietly, sinking onto the edge of her bed, the fragile happiness of the past weeks suddenly feeling as distant and impossible as it had always seemed before he crossed that ballroom for her. Downstairs, Colonel Edmund Hale, who had arrived moments earlier for an unrelated visit and had overheard the tail end of the confrontation from the hallway, found himself facing the Duke in the empty parlor, both men silent for a long moment. "You are a fool, Your Grace, if you believe that rumor," Colonel Hale said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I have known Eleanor Whitmore since she was a child. She has never once told a dishonest word in her life, not even the small dishonesties most people tell to smooth over social awkwardness. If someone has invented this story, I intend to discover who and why, before this causes any further harm to her reputation or her heart." The Duke studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his guarded eyes. "You care for her a great deal," he observed. "I have loved her for years," Colonel Hale admitted, the words costing him something to say aloud, especially to the man who had, in a matter of weeks, won what he himself had never found the courage to pursue. "Though I was too slow, and too fearful, to ever tell her so. I will not stand by now and watch her be destroyed by a lie, whether or not she ever chooses you over me." Something in the Colonel's steady honesty seemed to reach the Duke in a way Eleanor's own protests had not quite managed, perhaps because it came from a man with every reason to wish the rumor were true, and yet who defended her regardless. "Help me discover the truth of this, then," the Duke said finally. "If I have wronged her by doubting her too quickly, I intend to make it right. But I must know first whether there is any truth to the story at all." Colonel Hale nodded once, already turning toward the door. "I know exactly where to begin looking," he said. "I have noticed certain conversations these past weeks, conversations I did not think much of at the time, between your sister-in-law and Lord Ashby, conducted in voices too low and too frequent to be entirely innocent." The two men left the house together that night, united by a purpose neither had expected to share, each determined in his own way to see the truth uncovered before more harm could be done. Upstairs, Eleanor did not sleep. She lay in the darkness listening to the distant sound of carriage wheels on gravel, replaying the Duke's words again and again, until they had worn a raw, aching groove into her thoughts. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that the weeks of honest conversation between them had built something sturdy enough to withstand a single ugly rumor. Instead, it had cracked at the first pressure, revealing how thin the foundation truly was beneath his careful courtesy and her own cautious hope. She rose before dawn and walked the grounds alone, wrapped in a heavy shawl against the early chill, her mind turning over every kindness he had shown her since that first dance, searching for some sign she had missed, some proof that his doubt had been only a passing weakness rather than the truth of his character finally surfacing. She found no answer in the cold morning air, only the same unbearable uncertainty that had kept her from marriage for 9 long seasons, the fear that any affection offered to her might, at the first difficulty, reveal itself as conditional after all. Beatrice found her there an hour later, her feet damp from the wet grass, her expression distant. "You should not stand out here so long," Beatrice said gently, draping an additional shawl over her sister's shoulders. "You will catch a chill, and then Mother will have 2 disasters to manage instead of 1. "I do not know what to do, Beatrice," Eleanor admitted, her voice smaller than her sister had heard it in a long while. "I had begun to believe, truly believe, that something good might finally happen to me, and now I do not know if I imagined the whole of it." "You did not imagine it," Beatrice said firmly. "I saw the way he looked at you, Eleanor, at supper, in the garden, at every moment when he thought no one else was watching. That was not imagined. Whatever fear made him doubt you last night, it does not erase the truth of those weeks before it. Fear is a poor excuse for doubting someone who has given no cause for it." "It is a poor excuse," Beatrice agreed, "but it is also a very human one. You have spent 9 years guarding your own heart so carefully that no one could wound it easily. Can you truly fault a man for doing the same, even if he did it clumsily, and even if it hurt you badly in the process?" Eleanor did not answer at once, turning the question over slowly as the sun began to rise properly over the estate's bare autumn trees. She did not know, yet, whether she could forgive him, but she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to try, and that wanting itself felt like a kind of quiet courage she had not expected to find in herself so soon after being hurt. It took Colonel Hale only 2 days to uncover the truth. He began with the servants, quiet conversations conducted with the discretion of a man who had spent years commanding soldiers, and understood that loyalty could be earned through respect, rather than demanded through rank. A young footman in the Whitmore household, a boy named Peter who had always been fond of Eleanor for her kindness toward the staff, mentioned that he had overheard Lord Ashby and Miss Charlotte discussing a man called Frederick Vane on more than one occasion, always in hushed, urgent tones, always falling silent whenever anyone approached. From there, it was a matter of locating Mr. Vane himself, a task made easier by the fact that London society, for all its secrets, was ultimately a small and interconnected world. Colonel Hale found him at his club 2 evenings later, a somewhat weak-chinned young man who, after a firm conversation and the colonel's unmistakable implication that his continued silence would be far more comfortable than the alternative, confessed everything with very little resistance. He had been paid, he admitted, a modest sum by Lord Ashby, to walk near Green Park at a specific hour on 3 separate occasions, dressed in a manner that might, from a distance, suggest a private meeting with a lady, though he had never once actually spoken with Miss Whitmore, or been anywhere near her at all. The entire scene had been arranged and witnessed by a hired observer, a woman known for her willingness to spread gossip for a price, who had then ensured the story reached the right ears throughout London. Before confronting the family directly, the Duke insisted on speaking with Eleanor alone, arriving early on a grey morning, while the rest of the household still slept. He was shown into the small breakfast room where she sat with her tea gone cold and untouched, a book open before her that she had clearly not been reading. "I did not expect you this early, Your Grace," she said, rising from her chair, her voice carefully guarded. "I could not wait any longer," he said, "though I understand if you would rather I had." He told her then of Colonel Hale's discovery, of Mr. Vane's confession, of the hired woman who had spread the story for coin. Eleanor listened in silence, her expression unreadable, until he had finished. "You believed the rumor," she said finally, "before you knew any of this." "I did," he admitted, offering no excuse for it. "And I have spent every hour since regretting that I did not simply trust you from the first moment, the way I should have. I have no defense for it, Eleanor, except to say that fear makes fools of even careful men, and I was, in that moment, entirely a fool." "You called me by my given name," she observed quietly, some of the guardedness in her expression softening despite herself. "I have wanted to for some time," he admitted. "I did not think I had earned the right, until now, and I am still not entirely certain I have, but I find I can no longer manage the formality between us, not after nearly losing what little trust we had built." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing 9 years of caution against the plain, unguarded honesty in his face. "I do not forgive easily, Your Grace," she said. "It is not in my nature after so many years of being disappointed by people who claim to care for me." "I do not ask for easy forgiveness," he said, "only the chance to prove, over time, rather than in a single conversation, that I am worth the risk of trusting again." It was, Eleanor thought, very nearly the same offer he had made to her weeks earlier in the garden, when he had first asked simply to know her properly. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was willing to grant it a second time, not because the hurt had vanished, but because his willingness to name his own faults so plainly, without excuse or self-pity, felt like exactly the kind of honesty she had come to value most in him. "Very well," she said. "We shall see, Your Grace, whether time proves you right." Armed with the signed confession from Mr. Vane, gathered under the Colonel's watchful presence, Colonel Hale and Duke Sinclair arrived at the Whitmore estate the following afternoon, requesting that the entire family gather in the drawing room for a matter of some urgency. Eleanor entered last, her expression carefully composed, though the past 2 days had left visible shadows beneath her eyes. She had not spoken to the Duke since their confrontation, had, in fact, begun quietly preparing herself for the possibility that whatever had bloomed between them these past weeks was already over, crushed beneath the weight of a lie she had not told. "I have called this gathering," Duke Sinclair said, once the family had assembled, Lady Margaret confused, Charlotte visibly pale, Lord Ashby shifting uncomfortably near the window, "because Colonel Hale has uncovered the truth behind a rumor that has caused a great deal of harm to Miss Whitmore's reputation this past week. I believe everyone in this room should hear it." Colonel Hale stepped forward and read the signed confession aloud, his voice steady and clear, laying out in plain terms the arrangement between Lord Ashby, Mr. Vane, and a hired gossip who had spread the story throughout London for coin. He did not mention Charlotte's involvement directly, not yet, watching instead to see whether she would confess it herself. The color drained entirely from Charlotte's face as the confession was read. Lord Ashby's protests died in his throat, his earlier bluster crumbling beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. "Percival," Lady Margaret said slowly, turning toward him with dawning horror, "is this true?" "It was Charlotte's idea," Lord Ashby blurted, some final shred of self-preservation, overriding whatever loyalty he might once have felt toward his fiancée. "She came to me, frightened of what it would mean for her own standing if Eleanor became a duchess while she remained merely the wife of a second son. I only agreed to help because she asked it of me." Every eye in the room turned to Charlotte. She stood very still for a long moment, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking entirely. "You do not understand what it has been like," she said, her voice rising, equal parts fury and genuine distress. "My entire life, I have been the pretty one, the charming one, the daughter everyone expected great things from. And in a matter of weeks, Eleanor, plain, quiet, overlooked Eleanor, has become the most talked about woman in London, while I am reduced to being merely her younger sister. Do you know what that feels like, to watch everything you believed about your place in the world simply crumble away?" "I know exactly what that feels like, Charlotte," Eleanor said quietly, stepping forward for the first time since the confession had been read. "I have known it for 9 years, every single season, watching you receive the admiration I was told I could never hope to earn myself. I never once tried to destroy your happiness because of my own jealousy. I simply endured it, and told myself it was the natural order of things, that some sisters were meant to be admired, and others were meant to disappear quietly into the background." Charlotte's face crumpled, some of her fury giving way to something closer to shame. "I did not mean for it to go so far," she said, her voice small now. "I only wanted him to doubt you, not to ruin you entirely. You wanted to take from me the one thing that had ever truly been mine," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the tears now threatening at the corners of her eyes. "And you very nearly succeeded, Charlotte, not because your lie was so clever, but because it fed directly into wounds this family has spent 9 years carving into me. Wounds you helped carve yourself, one careless cruelty at a time." Lady Margaret, to her credit, did not attempt to defend Charlotte or minimize what had happened. She sat very still, her face pale, seeming for the first time to fully comprehend the years of favoritism and neglect that had led to this exact moment. "I have failed you both, in different ways," she said quietly. "I encouraged Charlotte's vanity because it flattered my own pride, and I neglected Eleanor's worth because I had convinced myself it did not exist. I am deeply ashamed of that now." Duke Sinclair had remained silent throughout the confrontation, watching Eleanor with an expression of growing remorse. When the room finally quieted, he stepped forward and addressed her directly, his voice low and urgent. "Miss Whitmore, I owe you an apology, far greater than words can properly convey. I allowed 6 years of my own hurt to make me quick to doubt you, when every action you had shown me deserved nothing but trust. I am deeply sorry." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, aware that the entire room watched them both, though she found she cared very little now for the audience. "You doubted me the moment a rumor reached your ears, Your Grace," she said, "despite everything we had shared these past weeks. That is not a small thing to forgive quickly." "I do not ask you to forgive it quickly," he said. "I only ask that you allow me the chance to earn that forgiveness properly, over time, rather than expecting you to simply grant it because I have apologized." Something in his willingness to accept that the wound could not be healed by words alone, that he would need to prove himself through actions rather than promises, softened something in Eleanor's chest that his earlier apology alone had not quite reached. "That," she said slowly, "is a request I find I can accept, Your Grace." The weeks that followed brought a quiet, careful rebuilding between them. The Duke called regularly, never again allowing gossip or doubt to shake his trust in her, and Eleanor, in turn, allowed herself gradually to lower the careful walls she had built over 9 years of disappointment. Charlotte, humiliated publicly and privately, withdrew from society for a time. Her engagement to Lord Ashby quietly dissolved in the aftermath of his cowardly betrayal, leaving her to face, for the first time in her life, a season without easy admiration to soften the world's edges. It was at a ball hosted by the Countess of Marlowe, some 6 weeks after the confession had unraveled Charlotte's scheme, that Duke Sinclair finally asked Eleanor to step with him onto the same terrace where, weeks earlier, an entirely different kind of conversation had once threatened to end everything between them. The night was clear and cool, stars visible above the London rooftops, the sound of the ballroom's music drifting faintly through the open doors behind them. "I have thought a great deal these past weeks," the Duke said, "about what I want, and about who I want beside me as I face it. I do not offer you grand declarations, Eleanor, because I know you have heard enough empty flattery from this world to distrust it entirely. I offer you only this. I have never, in all my years, met a woman who has endured so much and remained so fundamentally kind, so quietly strong, so unwilling to let cruelty make her cruel in turn. I would like very much to spend the rest of my life beside such a woman, if she would have me." Eleanor felt tears rise, unbidden and unstoppable this time, though they were tears of a very different kind than those she had shed weeks earlier. "I have spent 9 years believing I was meant to be alone, Your Grace," she said softly. I do not know quite how to accept that I might not be after all. You need only say yes, he said gently. The rest, I promise, we will learn together. Yes, Eleanor said, the word carrying 9 years of quiet endurance finally giving way to something new. Yes, Alistair, I will marry you. He kissed her then, gently, beneath the London stars, and when they returned to the ballroom a few minutes later, hand in hand, the entire room fell silent once more, though this silence carried none of the pitying whispers of 9 seasons past. Charlotte watched from across the room, her expression unreadable, though something in her posture suggested, for the first time, genuine reflection rather than resentment. Lady Margaret wept openly, whether from joy or shame, or some complicated mixture of both, no one could quite say. Colonel Hale, present at the ball though he had kept a respectful distance from Eleanor these past weeks, allowed himself a small, sincere smile, grateful, despite his own quiet grief, that the woman he had loved for so long had finally found the happiness she had always deserved. Beatrice crossed the room first, embracing her sister tightly. I told you, she whispered. I told you everyone would regret their laughter someday. You did, Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. I should have believed you sooner. In the weeks between the proposal and the wedding, Eleanor found herself, for the first time in her life, the center of genuine celebration rather than polite tolerance. Beatrice insisted on helping choose fabric for the wedding gown, spending long afternoons at the dressmakers poring over silk samples with a delight that made Eleanor laugh more freely than she had in years. Even Lady Margaret, still working to earn back some measure of her daughter's trust, threw herself into the preparations with genuine care rather than mere calculation, ensuring every detail reflected Eleanor's own quiet taste, rather than the grander, more fashionable choices she might once have insisted upon for appearance's sake alone. Charlotte kept her distance during those weeks, uncertain of her welcome, though she sent a short note a few days before the ceremony, brief but sincere, wishing her sister happiness and admitting, in careful, humbled language, that she had a great deal to reflect upon regarding the kind of sister she wished to become. Eleanor read the note twice, folded it carefully, and did not yet know what to make of it, though she found she no longer wished to hold on to anger the way she once might have. There would be time enough, she told herself, to see whether Charlotte's words carried any lasting change behind them. The wedding took place 2 months later, a quiet ceremony by the standards of the London season, though every family of consequence in the city sought an invitation regardless. Eleanor wore a gown of pale silver silk, simple and elegant, and as she walked toward the altar where Alistair waited, she caught sight of the same women who had once whispered so cruelly about her unmarried state, watching now with expressions of open admiration rather than pity. She did not gloat. She had learned, through 9 years of quiet endurance, that dignity mattered more than vindication, but she allowed herself, in that single moment, a small, private satisfaction, knowing that the woman they had once mocked as unremarkable had found, in the end, something far more valuable than the fleeting admiration Charlotte had once enjoyed so easily. She had found a love built on honesty, on being truly seen, rather than merely admired. Mrs. Agatha Combe visited Ravenswood often in those early years, her sharp eyes and steady counsel as valued in Eleanor's new life as they had been in her old one. On one such visit, not long after Eleanor's wedding, the old governess walked the estate's gardens with her former pupil, admiring the neat rows of late roses along the southern wall. You look well, my dear, Mrs. Combe said. Truly well, in a way I have not seen since you were a small girl, before the world taught you to make yourself smaller than you were. I feel well, Eleanor admitted, though I confess it still surprises me some mornings, waking in this house, remembering that I am not required to prove my worth to anyone here. That is precisely how it should feel, Mrs. Combe said. A marriage built on genuine regard should never require proof, only honesty. You found a rare thing, Eleanor. Do not ever let anyone, including your own old doubts, convince you that you do not deserve to keep it. Beatrice's first season, when it finally arrived, unfolded very differently from Eleanor's own. Eleanor made a point of accompanying her sister to every important gathering, ensuring Beatrice was properly introduced, properly seen, and never once left standing alone at the edge of a ballroom while others whispered about her prospects. Where Eleanor herself had endured 9 years of quiet neglect, Beatrice moved through her first season surrounded by a sister determined that no Whitmore daughter would ever again feel invisible in a crowded room. By the season's end, Beatrice had secured an engagement to a thoughtful young baronet who admired her sharp mind and gentle humor in equal measure, a match built, as Eleanor had insisted it must be, on genuine affection rather than mere convenience. 2 years passed before the family gathered again in full, this time at Ravenswood, the Duke's country estate, for a celebration marking Beatrice's own successful first season, a season Eleanor had made certain to attend fully, determined that her youngest sister would never once feel unseen, the way she herself had felt for so long. Eleanor moved through her new home with a quiet confidence that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known her at that first fateful ball. She managed the estate's affairs with the same careful competence she had once applied to her family's modest household, and Alistair, far from finding her diminished by comparison to London's more glittering ladies, had grown to depend on her steady judgment in matters both large and small. Their marriage had not been without its difficulties. Trust, once damaged, required patient tending, and there had been early months where old fears resurfaced, where Alistair caught himself doubting too quickly, where Eleanor found herself bracing for disappointment out of 9 years of hard habit. But they had chosen, again and again, to communicate honestly, rather than retreat into old patterns, and the marriage that emerged from that patient work was stronger for having been tested. Charlotte, humbled by the collapse of her engagement and the public exposure of her scheme, had spent the first year in quiet reflection, largely withdrawn from the society that had once adored her. It was Eleanor, surprisingly, who extended the first true gesture of reconciliation, inviting her sister to Ravenswood for an extended visit, not out of obligation but out of a genuine, hard-won understanding that cruelty often grew from wounds of its own. "I do not deserve your kindness," Charlotte had said quietly, on her first evening at the estate, watching Eleanor tend to correspondence with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything now. "Perhaps not," Eleanor had replied, without cruelty, simply stating the truth as she saw it. "But I have learned that holding on to old resentments serves no one, least of all myself. I would rather have a sister who has learned something from her mistakes than one I keep at arm's length forever out of old hurt." Charlotte had wept then, real tears, and something between the sisters had begun, slowly, to mend, though it would take years yet before the relationship fully healed, and Eleanor never again allowed herself to be treated with the casual cruelty of those early years. Colonel Hale, for his part, found his own happiness eventually, marrying a widow of gentle temperament he met while serving abroad, though he remained a close and trusted friend to both Eleanor and Alistair for the rest of his life, welcomed at Ravenswood as family rather than mere acquaintance. Eleanor never forgot the quiet loyalty he had shown her during the darkest week of the scandal, and she made certain he always knew how deeply that loyalty was valued. As for Eleanor herself, she never stopped writing, though she no longer felt the need to hide behind a pen name. Her stories, once penned in secret under cover of night, began appearing under her own name in literary journals throughout London, tales of quiet women who found unexpected courage, stories that resonated deeply with readers who recognized, in her careful, honest prose, echoes of their own overlooked lives. On a warm evening in early summer, Eleanor stood on the terrace at Ravenswood, watching her husband walk across the lawn toward her, their young daughter perched happily on his shoulders, laughing at something he had said. She thought, as she often did in quiet moments like this one, of that first ballroom, of 9 years of whispers and pitying glances, of a duke who had crossed an entire crowded room, simply because she had not smiled the way everyone else did. She had spent so many years believing herself unremarkable, convinced by a world too shallow to look beneath the surface, that she was meant to remain forever in the shadows, mentioned only in comparison to a sister who glittered more easily. It had taken one honest man, willing to look past what glittered and see instead what ran deep and quiet, to show her the truth she had always carried within herself, waiting patiently to be recognized. She was not, and had never been, unremarkable. She had simply been waiting for the world to finally see her clearly. Alistair reached the terrace, setting their daughter down gently before drawing Eleanor into his arms, the London ballroom and its cruel whispers now nothing more than a distant memory, replaced by a life built on honesty, patience, and a love that had crossed an entire crowded room to find her. "What are you thinking of?" he asked softly, noticing the faraway look in her eyes. "I am thinking," Eleanor said, smiling up at him, "that I am grateful, every single day, that you did not walk past me that night." "I could never have walked past you," he said simply. "Not once I had truly seen you." And beneath the warm summer sky, surrounded by a family built through patience, honesty, and hard-won trust, Eleanor Whitmore, once mocked and overlooked, once certain she was destined for a life alone, finally understood that she had never needed the world's approval to be worthy of love. She had only needed one person willing to truly look.